Hi, I'm Deborah Amos with National Public Radio. Thanks for joining us for this hour. We're going to talk about Syria. We're going to mark a couple of sad anniversaries. I hope that you will send us questions. We have an excellent panel. I think we're going to start with a film, and it's Syria, A Decade of Atrocities, which marks this war in very terrible ways. It's a 7-minute film, and on the other side, I will introduce our panel. So take it away.
Hi, I'm M. Night Shyamalan. And my wife and I, we have a foundation and we support leaders from around the world. And my wife went to the Holocaust Museum and she came back and said, hey, I want to support this leader. His name is Mouaz Moustafa, and he runs an organization called the Syrian Emergency Task Force, and they do work in Syria. And she started to tell me what they do, and I said, wait, I'm hesitant about Syria. I don't know if our foundation should get involved in it. That seems like a really messy thing. And I was reacting to something. I was reacting to a narrative that had been told to me over and over again, and I didn't realize it. It was a narrative that there was a civil war going on in Syria that was so messy and so violent and so entrenched, there was no way that you could get involved in that area. But I just realized that I was being told a story by somebody. Who was that somebody? Now here's the thing, I make movies, and we try very hard to pull the storyline out that is the most connected to the audience, the thing that will make you come to the movie theaters. That's the story we try to pull out and tell you and say, hey, this is the movie, this is the story, and then you feel connected to that story, and then you come to the movie. Well, in this case, the person telling the story wants just the opposite. They don't want you to come. They don't want you to get involved. So the person telling me the story of Syria is telling me a story so that I have that reaction, so that I don't want to get involved. And the person telling the story is Assad, and he's telling me the story of this violent, messy civil war that I should stay away from. But really, after learning what's actually happening in Syria, I realized there's an actual amazing story underneath it all that I'm very, very connected to. And this is the story I want to talk to you about. It was children that start this story. These children, inspired by us, inspired by America, went and spray painted on a wall the words freedom and your turn's next, doctor, referring to Assad. They were arrested. These children were tortured. And more protests rose, and more children protested. The country as a whole started to rise up. You had one city, then another, and they faced the military with flowers, and it was peaceful protests for as long as they could go. Our opinion was turning against Assad. So much so, it was inevitable it was going to end with the toppling of the dictator, and that's where it should have ended. Assad started telling his story to avoid the narrative of a group of families and children fighting for freedom to not get to us, to not get to the world. He immediately painted them as Muslim radicals and began the story of the civil war in Syria, because eventually he would have been toppled. And things could have worked out in the way that it should have if Russia hadn't gotten involved and Iran hadn't gotten involved. Both of them got involved for their own reasons. None of them good. Then ISIS sees a vacuum in all of this mess and decides to come into Syria. And Assad loves this. He loves this because now he can tell the Western world he's fighting our enemy. And that creates even more confusion in the mix. And so this story of this messy civil war is now entrenched, and the world steps away. Atrocities are happening on a scale we can't imagine, and people are getting slaughtered. Here we are, 10 years later. And how did this never again moment happen? How is it still going on? Well, it's because of the story that we were told. We shouldn't forget about the real story, about children fighting for freedom. Children have disappeared. I had gotten a chance to spend time with Caesar, who was a police photographer who took all the photos took 50,000 photos of victims of Assad's torture and brought them out of the country to show the world. And as I sat here, he actually showed it to me in this room, I was chilled and moved, and I felt very much connected to those kids, that their story was my story. The story of my dad coming to America here to start a new life, to dream about freedom for himself and his family, that they were dreaming the same dreams. Those kids could be me. They actually even looked like me. I felt very connected to them. I live in Philadelphia, the home of the Liberty Bell and the Declaration of Independence, those symbols of American democracy. And I see in the Syrian people, even after 10 years of atrocities, I see in them that spirit, that wish for democracy that defines America. I see them as an extension of our story, and our story and their story are interlaced. People fighting for freedom and democracy. And children started it. We inspired those children, and those children should inspire us right back. That's not a complicated story to hold on to. Children fighting for freedom.
So we're back again. That is a sobering opening to this panel. I want to introduce everyone on our panel and ask them just to give a couple of moments of their introduction, and I will do it in the order that I can see you on the screen. And I'm going to start with Stephen Rapp.
Well, it's good to be with you all. I was a former international prosecutor after I prosecuted in the U.S. Both did the work on the Rwandan genocide and the mass atrocities committed in West Africa and Sierra Leone. And then for 6 years served as ambassador at large for global criminal justice in the State Department, and was there when the Syrian uprising began. And though I was involved in accountability on a dozen different fronts, quickly saw Syria as a place where the worst atrocities in the world were happening. And it was impossible to achieve accountability because Russia was blocking the United Nations and the usual routes that we had to justice. So after I left the State Department, I continued to work on this issue with the support of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, informally advising Caesar and the SETF, chair of CEJA, an organization that's collected more than 1 million pages of documents from inside Syria, noting, as I have often, that the documentation of these mass crimes and the responsibility of the regime is better even than we had at Nuremberg. The challenge has been finding a place for justice, and hope we can talk about that this afternoon.
Dr. Bhavna Shyamalan.
Hi, so I'm Bhavna Shyamalan. I actually came across Mouaz through the exhibit at the Holocaust Museum. So I went there and I saw some of the documentation you were talking about, photographs that had been pulled out by a man codenamed Caesar from the grounds in Syria about the mass atrocities and killings and torture that have been happening. And I think this was maybe 6 or 7 years into all the killings. And honestly, I had not even known anything about it. And so I dug deeper, met Mouaz. And we have, my husband and I have the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation, and we learned so much more about what was going on in Syria through Mouaz, visited Turkey, the border of Syria with Mouaz, met many Syrians who are now there, refugees and people that have been working in the rehabilitation centers and have been fighting the fight, and just deeply moved and moved by what's happening there and about the dire situation there in Syria that's continued now for 10 years. And we support Mouaz in the work that he does. So.
Thank you. Andrea Kalin.
So when I met Mouaz, he was, he used the name that he was a freelance revolutionary, and very intriguing at that. I know he had some experience with the Libyans, with the Egyptians. Then he came on to the Syrians, and it was kind of like you meet Mouaz and you say, you gotta make a movie about this guy. I mean, he was in his early 20s, the access that he had at the time and still has. And most importantly was the stories that he was bringing out of Syria, the stories of the activists and the stories that were defying the dominant narrative. And it was that drew us in. I always believe that documentary filmmaking is art on the front lines. And I felt that it was our responsibility to take his stories and to try to amplify them. How we were going to do that was another story. We didn't have the resources or the support, but we were determined to not leave any stone unturned. And we were going to make this film, which was Red Lines. And I was the producer, co-director, and writer on the documentary. And Deb, we were together in the field at one point. That's the last time actually we were physically in the same space. And I think both of us could share that if even 10 years have passed, there's so many memories that swirl in your mind. Some of them are warm and touching, but many of them are painful. And I think that it's what rises to the top always, or cuts through all that, is the determination and the persistence and the resilience of the Syrian people. And it's the Syrian people that we stay and remain connected to.
And I want to say and give a big applause to Red Lines and to say that the people who are here today will be interested in watching it. And Andrea, are there places that they can see it online?
Yes, you can see it on our Spark website and on Vimeo on demand.
Great. Omar Alshogre.
Yes, I am trying to enjoy my life as much as I can during the time of working with the Syrian Emergency Task Force to bring as much goodness to the Syrian people, to the Syrian community, trying to do the legal work, the political work, and the humanitarian work, and to try to represent as much of our cause as possible, using my love to public speaking. So I'm a storyteller, and I'm someone who's been supported as much by Mouaz as the other Syrian people are.
Mm-hmm. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Mouaz Moustafa.
Thanks so much, Deb, and it's so nice to be with such an amazing panel that are also family to all of to me. My name is Mouaz Moustafa. I've worked with the Syrian Emergency Task Force for the last 10 years, and previous to that, I used to work on the Hill in the House and Senate. And I want to just give a quick thank you to Spark Media for making this possible, for making Red Lines, for documenting the work of SETF for those first few years, as well as the revolution in Syria for those years, as well as that powerful video that introduced the event today. And I want to really thank Dr. Bhavna Shyamalan and the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation, because they've been our lifeline and safety net through years where we've worked on Syria and so many people have sort of turned away. So thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to mark that this is an anniversary, and it's the anniversary of the chemical attack in Ghouta. And that was one that many of us saw. There were videos coming out. It was early, it was shocking. I think Daria is also having an anniversary. And so because of the topic that we are talking about today, I'd like to have a minute of silence. Thank you. That is a minute. Omar, I want to start with you because the rest of us, of course, were overwhelmingly affected by the war, but you lived it. You lived it and you survived it, and you were not a child, but pretty close when you went to jail at 17. When I met you in Sweden, you also taught me something about resilience. What you were worried about in prison is that you weren't handsome anymore for a while. You're handsome again. And I would laugh about that when you would say it, and assure you that you were handsome now. And so I want to ask you a little bit about, you see these pictures. Is there any way to tell people about how awful it was?
Firstly, my friend, I wish I could take you back in time to show you Syria, how beautiful it was. From nature to people to culture, to the streets, to the mountains, to the sea, all of it was very beautiful. And I'm sad a lot of people, at least the young people in the West, they don't know. They only remember Syria and think about Syria as a war zone. It is beautiful, even though it's war, and it was very beautiful as well. These pictures of those people who died in brutal ways, with chemical attacks or them being killed, slaughtered in multiple ways. It's tough to understand. It's tough to imagine, to think about it. Even if you experience the brutality of the regime, it's tough to just rethink about them and try to find a way, how could a human being do that? But I want you to think about the emotions of the mother who survived there, you know? Because for some mothers, for some family members, surviving is even worse because you lost everything you have. Can you imagine losing your mom? Imagine losing your dad, your brother, your siblings, and your cat and your dog and your hamster. And at the same time, they bombed your school and there is no roads to walk on anymore, and you have nothing left. Life is very empty. Can you imagine that? This loneliness that on its own can kill you. That's the feeling most of the Syrian mothers went through before they became resilient enough to be able to enjoy their life despite all the brutalities they went through. People did not just go through that. They are still going through these brutalities on a daily basis in Syria. The regime is still in power. The war is still going on. It's important to think about everything going on in the world. It's important to pay attention to Afghanistan, but it's very important to not forget Syria because there is something happening somewhere else. All these cases deserve our attention. All these people suffering, they all need our help, and we should never hesitate or wait to help because we prioritize something over something else.
Omar, I think about that when I'm in Germany. I've been told that there are 50,000 Syrian refugees who have some connection to the torture chambers. Either they were tortured, or their family was, or they lost people there. And I see a lot of hollow eyes there, people who are not over it yet. Mouaz, I want to turn to you. And this is a tough time. Assad has won the war. He beat you at this moment. I've seen this before in the Middle East, people who had great plans and have been stymied by dictatorships who would stop at nothing. And this one certainly is in that category. And I wonder how you think about it. You're in Washington, you have fabulous access, but there's only so much you can do. And so how do you think about the future and where you put your efforts?
It's a great question, Deb. And yeah, we've seen over the last 10 years that the Assad regime has made massive achievements on the ground in terms of retaking cities, forcibly displacing civilians, detaining them, or killing them, which is, by the way, is the exact sort of formula for any area that's not under Assad regime control. And we have had to also learn over time, and we've now dealt with into the fourth, I think, administration working on Syria, that there are certain policy limitations. Sometimes there is just a lack of attention, and as I look at the situation as it is today, it's important to remember that although the Assad regime has made some military advancement, by the way, because 80% of his ground troops at one time were Iranian-backed militias and IRGC, because he has the entirety of the Russian Air Force, and because he's facing, by the way, people that have that are just civilians for the most part, and then opposition fighters that are way less equipped than he is. So the miracle, by the way, is that the Assad regime, despite all of this, has not been able to gain control over Syria, has not been able to declare victory. And I think that's a testament not to the fighters or anyone, but to the Syrian people. It's also a reminder that the regime is literally fighting the people of Syria, and not just a specific faction. It's not just a civil war and so on. But the focus for us now is the prevention of further atrocities. Unfortunately, just today and this week, we have 2 massacres. I mean, if you think about the number of Srebrenicas that have happened in Syria, the number of Kosovo market bombings, right? These, by the way, inflection points that mobilize the world to end genocide elsewhere. That has become a regularity in Syria. The utilization of chemical weapons, if it happened tomorrow, none of us would be super surprised. And that's a scary thing in this century. But we know that between Rukban camp in the south and internally displaced 10,000 people, the northeast, where we still have U.S. troops there, and you have many civilians too that fear a U.S. withdrawal that may lead to Iran and the Assad regime and Russia taking over and torturing, displacing, and killing civilians. And finally, where we have the highest risk of atrocities, both in Daraa, the birthplace of the revolution, that's today under a more than 60-day brutal siege and regular bombardment, in the northwest, where we run a school for orphans at a women's center, we have 4 million civilians, 1 million of them children, in an ever-shrinking space that will either be killed, displaced, or detained if we don't make clear that no more killing will be tolerated in Syria. And if it's not for the humanitarian reasons, we need to stop the killing for our own national security and for the strategic interests of the United States and our allies. So what we're calling for today isn't for a massive intervention. It's not for any further troop deployments. It is not for the removal of the Assad regime. It is simply to protect the areas in places that are liberated from regime control in Syria, to show the world what areas outside of Assad regime control can be. And at the same time, in doing so, it becomes conducive to a political solution. Because right now, there's only a military solution on the table, and it's that of Iran, Assad, and Russia. And I think if the international community makes clear that these other areas, especially like Idlib, will not be allowed to just be destroyed, then I think that will allow us to begin a process of a political transition, or at the very least, ending of the killing there. And so we've, it's, I don't think Syria is hopeless. And it's not because of the people on the ground that work there, but it's also because the United States, our European allies, and our other allies in the region have the power today to at least end the killing where it is now, and then pursue a political transition. Sorry for the long answer.
It's okay. Bhavna, what role does your organization play, and what role should philanthropists play? Is there something that you can do that, at least relieves some of the suffering?
There's the direct stuff of the humanitarian aid, so that's one level of it. And Mouaz has been working with children. They have an underground kind of orphanage, and they're educating 77 kids right now. And they've had to be moved around a few times, but providing supplies for them, resources for them. There's a women's group that he runs. There's also the IDP camps and the refugee camps, and who have nothing. They have nothing, and there are massive amounts of people that have been displaced in Syria that just do not have any supply, do not have any education. So providing them while they're in this situation right now, so that they can survive, at least, survive and continue life in some ways. That's one way that we're trying to support what's going on in Syria. The other thing really is awareness, and it's really counteracting the stories that have been told, as you saw in the video that my husband was talking about. When we initially came across what was happening in Syria, we weren't interested enough, because it was messy. It seemed like, factions fighting factions in Syria, a civil war, just rebels fighting the regime, and it did not feel like anything we wanted to get close to. But through Mouaz, through Caesar and the photos that he's gotten out, through the films that have been done like Red Lines, and through Omar telling his stories, it's really understanding that these are human stories. These are human stories of suffering in a way that people should not have to suffer. And I feel like part of our work is to really continue to broadcast those stories, find ways for people to hear those stories so they don't forget what's happening in Syria. And we're, as human beings, we're so distracted. There's so much going on in life, and we're almost just distracted by what's happening to us now. Like, where am I going to, when am I going to get my nails done, or this and that? And it's, as we're doing that, kids are being killed. I mean, literally. And it is hard sometimes to accept that and bring that in and to say, worry. We don't always want to be worrying and thinking about difficult things. But unless we do that, this is allowed to happen. So I think part of our work is helping Mouaz and, everybody here on this panel, really, that have been working so hard to keep the Syrian story alive, to do that, to help them do that in any way possible.
So Bhavna raises an interesting point that I want to ask you about, Andrea, and that is keeping the story alive. I know in my own company, we do some Syria, but not much. Everybody's now reporting on Afghanistan. The world has moved on. If you could, and if, well, I advise people to watch this film. It's a great film. But if you watch it now, it's like, oh, okay, everything's fine, except it's not. If you could go back and make another film, what would you do?
I think I would not even need to go back to make another film. I think the film continues to be made because the human toll, unfortunately, continues to climb. And I think, when I look back at Red Lines, I think that the huge loss that we were starting to open up and show in that film was this civilian secular alternative, which is completely opposite to what Assad's narrative that, minus the government, it would go into complete chaos taken over by extremists. And you saw these enclaves of democracy. And I think that actually exists again in the Northwest. So there's another opportunity to continue to show these stories that are countering that there's only two options, either boots on the ground or nothing at all. And I think that the Syrians keep telling their own story. We just have to listen and be able to share it.
Correct. Stephen Rapp, let me ask you a little bit about Germany. It's a very interesting process that's happening there. It is an accountability trial. Can you just explain what that is and why it is important and why it is unprecedented? Hang on, you're muted.
Anyway, it's extremely important that Germany has become involved because, as I said earlier, the usual routes to accountability through the UN Security Council have been blocked, and the impact of that is profound globally. I mean, Assad's violating norms that have frankly been observed for decades. I mean, attacks on hospitals have been banned since 1863, and was a rule followed even through World War II, and now hundreds of attacks on hospitals. Doctors are in more danger than ISIS people, to be frank. From the Assad regime, and the use of poison gas. The world turned its back on poison gas after the Western Front, 103 years ago, and established these international treaties and generally observed, with a few small exceptions. And then, we have attacks like the one 8 years ago that killed at least 1,429 men, women, and children in East Ghouta in a matter of minutes. And chemicals continue to be used. And the disappearance of people, the horrible crime of not knowing where your loved one is, that's pulled off the street, no official arrest, no record, no court to go to, nothing, and hundreds of thousands of people then disappeared into these dungeons that Omar lived in, and so many of his family and others died in, to the extent that they were, documented in the Caesar photos. But Caesar just took photos for about 20 months of people coming out of mainly for detention facilities in Damascus, and his numbers totaled more than 11,000 individual victims if you count up what's the numbers on those bodies, and so tens of thousands of similarly been murdered. And so how do we have accountability? What's the signal is, if you have protection from Russia or and you can block the UN, you can block international mechanisms, you're going to get away with it. The answer, fortunately, has been found in Germany, and we hope in other countries. We've had cases prosecuted in third countries for crimes committed abroad. We've done it in the U.S. in regard to crimes in Liberia or in Rwanda. Usually, it's relatively low-level individuals decades later who are discovered to have been war criminals and to have come in with refugees. With the refugees pretending to be victims instead of victimizers. So we've had those kinds of things. But Germany has put more into this than any other country. It's got 2 investigative units. It has a well-equipped federal prosecutor's office, and of course, it's welcomed 800,000 Syrian victims, survivors of these crimes. It's been profoundly affected by these crimes. Those people wouldn't be in Germany today if there were just a war being fought along a front, or that where only combatants were being injured and killed. It's because the war is fought against the civilians that they're in Germany. So it's entirely appropriate that they use their so-called universal jurisdiction, which gives them the ability to prosecute any crime anywhere, provided nobody else is doing it effectively, and provided they've got the evidence and the ties to that situation that make that legitimate. And so they have put out an international arrest warrant for Jamil Hassan, the head of Air Force Intelligence, a powerful individual responsible for one of the worst detention facilities that the regime maintains, the Jawiya facility of Air Force Intelligence at El Meza, not far from the presidential mansion of Assad, not far, and actually on the same grounds as the hospital where Caesar was taking the photos. And he's been indicted. Of course, will he travel? Will he be able to arrest him? That's challenging. But it certainly sends a signal he should never take a trip. He should never have a quiet night. But they have been able to find some individuals, thanks to civil society organizations and victims coming forward and identification and a whole lot of things that I can talk about in terms of documentation by groups like CJID, groups of civil society organizations that are Syrians that have really helped put this together. And they've now put 2 individuals on trial, convicted one of them, a lower level of offender. They're still continuing with the trial as to the second offender, which they can do under their system. Just saw the testimony that was or late last month, incredibly dramatic. I mean, they brought in the Caesar photos, they brought in the experts, they verified it, not fake news. They've shown that it's rock solid. They brought in victims. They brought in a doctor. This is a recent witness that described. He said these bodies that were being brought to the hospital that were dead and alive, and he said they look just like the Caesar photos. And when he tried to treat somebody, they would beat on him or beat on his nurse and prevent him from providing aid and assistance. It just continues to get corroborated. An individual that did a refrigerator truck taking bodies to mass graves long after Caesar got out, but on into 2017 until he got out. He was moving thousands of bodies to mass graves around Damascus, to the extent that we are certainly talking about more than 100,000 people tortured and murdered in custody. And so this trial is going forward against now a colonel who was found in Germany, and he's facing potentially a life sentence. And there's direct evidence as far as his implication in 58 torture murders. They've also charged the doctor, not a benevolent doctor, but a doctor that in Homs, as we remember, military hospitals there became torture centers where people who were so-called dissidents were horribly treated. And he's now been arrested, and he will soon be tried in Germany. Chemical weapons case has been filed there by the German prosecutor with the assistance and with the instigation of victims and survivors. Also in France, and 3 days ago in Sweden. Congratulations, Omar, to your friends there. But they are proceeding with prosecutions on the chemical weapons issue. That's more challenging to find the people involved in chemical weapons because the guys that were involved in torture were, face to face with these problems, and the guys involved in torture were in chemical weapons. How horrible the crimes are, and the number of men, women, and children that are victims. It's harder to identify the specific individuals, but there's enormous documentation to do that. So we are seeing some justice. It's not sufficient. It's not strategic enough. There are not enough countries doing it, but at least it's one positive step for the truth for these victims, and a signal to the rest of the world that no matter who your friends are, we'll find a way to hold you to account.
Let me ask you, Omar. So you were in Branch 215. The trial in Germany is about Branch 251. It is narrow. It is about one man, a colonel now. And all the witnesses are from that branch. So you have no way to testify about what happened to you. Does it feel too narrow as you think about it? I know that you do want to testify, but does it feel too narrow how this justice business is going along in Germany and Sweden? You are muted, the phrase of our age.
So I think it's really important that the people that's the closest to the case are the ones that get the chance to testify. But then furthermore, in case they need any people who've been working with the system, like I was numbering the dead bodies. So the car I would carry the dead bodies to from branch to 15 under the floor upstairs, it will be already backed with bodies, and we will have some more coming to the car. So that's in addition details the court may need to know more about. So Caesar tells the story from the bodies arriving to the hospital. He's taking the photos. I tell the story before that. When people get into prison, when people get tortured, when people die, when people get numbered. And then from there, Caesar complete the story. So if they need that, if that's helpful for the case, I think they will reach out to have the testimony. But it's not about being out and testifying for no purpose. You want to testify for to bring value for the cases that you actually telling in these countries. But also, we consider the possibility of having cases against people who've been working in 215, since a lot of people work in 215, and there should be some of them in Europe. There should be people that we should be able to identify. It's not easy because you're talking about a few people and 500,000 people. It's not easy to find. Most of them change their names, and some guards you sometimes in prison don't see them at all. But the good thing is that we still alive, and if we bring a person, we will be able to testify. We exist here. We're strong enough to stand in the court in front, face to face with the person who tortured us. So that's the best part about it.
Mouaz, this is something that's happening in Europe. It is covered in Europe. It is not covered much here in the United States. Is there a way for the United States to have some trial like this? We don't have universal jurisdiction, but there are other ways to do this. Do you foresee a trial here?
Well, as a matter of fact, I am hopeful, and I do, and I know that Ambassador Rapp can maybe add to my comments, but I want to say that the Assad regime holds, at least in terms of our organization, the families that we work with, we know of at least 6 individuals, American citizens, that are being held in these very same dungeons. We also know about American citizens that have been either tortured to death in regime prisons or targeted, like Marie Colvin, who was murdered by the Assad regime, and you see her, you hear her voice in the beginning of Red Lines and even the trailer, as she reported so bravely from Homs. I can say that in the United States, I think there are routes to both civil and, more importantly, criminal cases against the Assad regime. As part of our team, we have multiple members of the team that are American citizens that have been held in solitary or brutally tortured, including Kevin Doss, Sam Goodwin, and others. And I also, as I mentioned, there are Americans that have perished in the regime's prisons. And I can tell you that we as SETF are working in pursuit of that. There are also some details that are not quite as public yet, but I can tell you that this is something that I'm hopeful will happen in the US soon. And I'd be curious, if it's okay with you, Deb, if Ambassador Rapp wanted to speak a little bit to, what are the ways that we can bring across potentially criminal prosecutions against the Assad regime based on what he has done to American citizens.
Well,
Ambassador Rapp, is that possible?
Oh, glad to. And certainly our laws could be better in the U.S. We could have a crimes against humanity statute. We could have some of the laws that other countries have adopted. But it is possible to prosecute murders of American citizens that happened abroad or dual nationals. And so a criminal case could be brought against Maher Assad, for instance, for the murder of Marie Colvin. He gave a reward to the guy who got the shot that killed her and her cameraman. And that is shown in that default judgment against Syria in the civil case, rendering a $300 million judgment against the Syrian state. Rock solid evidence of direct implication. Of course, is he going to get to the United States? Russia? If he goes to Russia, nobody's going to arrest him there. So you have that kind of challenge, as you do with others. And we don't have a lot of Syrians in the United States that we suspect are ex-regime individuals. And so that question, when you do have a victim who's an American, though that's only one of a lot of other crimes, it seems kind of selective. But when you can do that kind of symbolic case, it's often difficult to get your hands on the perpetrator. It does call, however, for greater cooperation between states, North and South. You need to be able to do like we did with the Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout, who turned up in Thailand trying to do a deal. And we got him arrested in Thailand and brought him to Manhattan and tried him for 25 years. A guy who was complicit in mass atrocities for Charles Taylor and others in West Africa. So sometimes you can make this work if you give it the kind of priority that you should. But generally with the U.S., it's going to take an American citizen victim and then a really major operation to figure out how to get the suspect, or it takes perpetrator, usually a low-level perpetrator, in the United States that committed the crime quite a long time ago.
Let me ask this, as a philanthropist, as somebody who has a foundation that works on Syria, is justice a possibility? Is Bhavna, is that a subject that you all take on?
Yes, but I think it's through different avenues of supporting people who are doing that work. But that is the value behind the work is ultimately justice. You know, it's the work that we do. It's social justice, racial justice. You know, all kinds of justice. That is why we even do anything. Really, that's the ultimate hope. So it's hopeful to think that things can happen. And honestly, we all hope for, you know, big, huge kinds of justice. You know, Assad gets his due and everything. But honestly, even the one family that gets their justice, I think is worth it. So it's each family at a time. It's each human being at a time. And if we continue to fight for that, those little steps, you never know where you can go. And, you know, we're not going to get all of it, but I think it's certainly worth it. And that's the hope. Because if we don't do that, what are we saying, right? What are we saying and what are we allowing?
Well, hope is such an interesting word. It is certainly something that torture survivors talk about. You know, how do you get your hope back? You have seen the worst of human beings. And I just wondered if, you know, even if you just deal with one family, if the idea that you give a damn is as close to justice as sometimes people get.
I have to say, like in some of the interviews that we did in Syria when we met with people, you can see it in their eyes. You know, so much of, even in Syria, but other places that we've done work, the story that's told or the things that's told to me by the people that we interview is don't forget us. You know, and that's really what it is. You know, we met a family, her name was Mrs. B, and I'm Dr. B, but she had 3 children. I have 3 children, and she was, you know, we came to her house. She was in Turkey at the time and had gotten out of Syria. Her husband had disappeared, been killed by the regime for nothing. They don't even know why they didn't even know for a long time. The way that she found out that her husband was dead was through the Caesar photos, when she eventually flipped through them and she saw them. And she was scared to even say that that was really him. So she showed her son, and her son said, yes, that's our father and he's dead. And that's how they knew. And it's, you know, it's knowing that story. And all she was worried about at that point, we came to her house and she had all this food for us, like snacks and things. And she and her children ate nothing. Like they didn't eat anything. They just gave what they had to us. And her hope was to start a new life and get her children educated. And her son had wanted to be this, kind of doctor but right now he was doing little things to just survive and work. And so when you talk about hope and when you talk about justice, you know, that if I don't know where she is now.
I would like to just add, you know, this individual, Mrs. B, will call her that Bhavna met during this trip, and on this, you know, really powerful trip, we met with the survivors of chemical weapons attacks and others. But this person is the widow, and those kids are the orphans of the Spanish case victim, Ambassador Rapp, that you've also been very involved in. And the fact is that, and as Bhavna is saying, I mean, justice for one family is the world in a way, but at the same time, I think other Syrians take their justice from that. They understand that you know, if this person's willing to help get justice against these 4 criminals, it's as if they've gotten it for their son or daughter or husband and brother, because it's the same criminals, it's the same crimes. And what's really sad about Syria is that because, you know, it's not signatory to the Rome Statute, because of Russians blocking, you know, going to the ICC, often when people recognize pictures in the Caesar photos and talk to us, We have to, and they want justice. We have to ask, well, is your son or daughter also a dual national of another country? It's another reminder of how unfair the world has been to Syria. But she and her kids had to leave in the middle of the night because the case was being filed in Madrid. And the Assad regime would arrest her in a second, would take vengeance on her and her kids to try to stop her sister who is in Spain, or her sister-in-law who's in Spain, who's filing the case on behalf of her brother, the gentleman that was killed for no reason. He wasn't even part of the protests. He was just picked up at a checkpoint and killed. And she today continues to have that hope and resilience. And quite honestly, it's because of the support of the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation and the work of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, where we have a victims fund that specifically caters to the key witnesses, victims, and families of victims that are tied to these international prosecutions that are not just on their behalf, but on behalf of millions of Syrians that have had so much loss at the hands of the war criminals of the Assad regime and its allies.
How many people have been threatened, do you think?
Oh my goodness, Caesar's been threatened. Mazen, who you've gotten to know very well, not only threatened, but essentially manipulated and you know, they lured him back to Syria, which is the worst nightmare. He's got an inspirational story, and he's a dear friend and a dear friend of many of the people here. And I'll just maybe, if you don't mind, Omar, talk a little bit about, if you're comfortable with it, have you been threatened in Sweden? And because I think that exemplifies what many are going through.
Okay, let me get the threat, the justice, and the hope all together in one story. I always been very hopeful, even during my time in prison. And there was one question keeping me awake every night during my time in prison. That question was, what makes this guard, who knows that I'm innocent, and he knows that I am a minor, and he knows that I just missed my mom, what makes this person enjoy torturing me, seeing me in pain? And I thought about it one day, twice, 3 times, 3 days, 1 year, 2 years, and I tried to justify his action because I wanted to understand how he's thinking, because he had so much time to think. And I wanted to think about his own thoughts. And I did not have a complete answer for all of that. And I got out of prison. I made it to Sweden, where I needed medical treatment. And once I was on a TV interview and was on Skype, and there was a photo behind me in the room, and the one who was interviewing me asked me the question, "Who's that in the photo? Is that your father?" And I just looked behind, and Deb knows very well that I have another photo, which is not my father, and it's the guard who tortured me in prison. And I had this picture in my bedroom for a long time until I don't think about it when I'm in an interview anymore. And I said, it's not my father, it's the guard. And the interview ended. And this was life. There was like no step back. And not long time after that, I received a phone call, and that person said hi. And it was like a Syrian phone number. It has been a while since I received a call from a Syrian number. I was very excited and said hi. And that voice was not something I could forget. I could remember painful memories. I could remember my cousin dying in my arms and seeing, just the blood everywhere, and this voice laughing. And I recall the straight that it's the guard who was torturing me for 1 year, 9 months. That's a long time. And you would never forget this voice. And he threatened me to shut up and so on. And I ended up saying, because I was recording the call, as soon as I heard the hi, I recorded the call. So I want to keep my mouth very nice and all of that. And I asked him this question: if you answer me honestly for this question, I would never mention your name in an interview or anything. I would never have a case against you, and nobody would know anymore about you. And he said, what is this question? I said, what made you enjoy torturing me? Give me a reason, like an honest reason, and I would never talk about you anymore. And I'm not forced to say that. And it was silent for some time. And then I could hear. So he was, I would say, partly crying. And again, he was still in a position of power that he's actually does not need to pretend to cry at all. So he cried. But more than that, we talked for 90 minutes, 91 minutes, and all of it's recorded. So after finishing the call, I re-listened to it many times, trying to understand and put together all the pieces he mentioned to realize that I'm not saying that to justify his action, but I'm sharing that to tell you how he thinks. So if I take you as a guard to prison, let's say I am the guard, to make it easy for you guys, and the officer behind me tells me, torture this guy in front of you, 100 belts. If you don't do it, I will torture you. I would think about it that way. Well, if I get tortured for not torturing that guy who I don't know who it is on the floor, and I may end up myself in prison, and my wife and a few kids outside, they won't get money, they won't get food, they won't get anything, and they will be in trouble and they may die. My family would die. I will die for the sake of a guy I don't know who he is. That's not logical thinking, right? So the guard managed to justify his actions and to feel, well, what I'm doing it to protect my family. Now you have not only justified you doing it for a good purpose, to protect your family. So they managed to justify their actions. So they actually managed to some extent in the end to enjoy doing it, because they're doing it to protect their families. And after doing anything for many, many, many times, it get normalized, and your brain you don't mentally get affected to it during the process. Now we go back to the hopeful part about it. There is few things in my life that gave me as much hope and justice as I get from that moment. Because the guard who managed to keep me silent for 1 year, 9 months, I was not allowed to speak. I only whispered. When I asked him the question, he was silent for minutes. I managed, after so many years, to make him shut up for some time, to make him cry, right? And that for me was a moment of justice, because there's nothing on this planet will give me back those 3 years. They just gone. And there's nothing on this planet that can actually bring back my father and my brothers. They are gone. They died. So I cannot count that there is a justice that will be enough to bring me back anything that I lost. It's not going to work that way. So just the definition of justice has changed in my head. And I count justice as, how much rewards I am getting in my daily life. What I get into Georgetown, tuition was crazy. Somebody reached out to pay tuition. I need housing. Somebody reached out to give house. That's reward for everything I went through, for losing so much. Then I was hopeless at some time, and I found Mouaz. Then I've been supported by experts. Then I met the Shyamalan. I met, Deborah. I met Ambassador Stephen Rapp, Andrea, James, and everyone. This is so much rewards I'm having on a daily basis in my life. That's justice for me.
Well, as always, Omar, it's always hard to top you. And we are at 2:00. This has been a fabulous talk. I'm going to ask each one of you to say your name and your final words, and then we will let everybody go off and have their lives. I'm going to start with you, Stephen Rapp. You are muted. The sentence of our time.
It is great listening to Omar, but it reminds me of all my engagement and with victims and survivors and justice, and it's even why it's so important to have trials, victims who finally are able to come to court and before having been on the ground and beaten and seeing all the horrors committed against others, and the individual who is now in the dock, then having been all powerful, that person having been brought down by the law and being made to answer for their crimes. And it can happen in ways other than trials, absolutely. But I think it shows us why the fight that we're in is so important. for Syrians like Omar, for others that are suffering as we speak, but for everybody who could be involved in systems where they commit crimes like this, or they're forced to commit crimes like this, to achieve some level of accountability for those victims and survivors, and also in the hope that can discourage and deter other crimes in the future. And that's why we'll continue to work on these efforts for as long as any of us draw breath.
And Dr. B, I've decided that that's the easiest way for me. We also have a question from the audience, so I'm going to roll this in with your final words, and that is, what can we do? What can people do?
Find people like Mouaz and Omar and Senator Rapp and all of you that are doing something. I mean, honestly, like initially I was like, why am I even on this panel? Because I don't feel like we do anything in particular, but we care, and we're supporting people that are the angels doing the work and that know how to do the work. I mean, since I've known Mouaz, he's made incredible strides since you see the period in the documentary and what's happened since. What SETF has been able to achieve is incredible. Like laws passed, people, it's just been incredible. So you find the people that are doing the work, support them, support SETF, support Omar, support Andrea and the work that she does to get the word out there. And anything that you can do to support the people doing the things is also a great thing. So that's my piece.
Andrea. Muted,
which was probably good, because after he spoke, I had to just kind of take a really deep breath, Omar, because it was so powerful. And a reminder that I feel that even in the most monstrous times, that humanity will make its way through. And everyone on this panel too is a light in that way. Each of you, the work that you're doing, the care, the commitment, the storytelling, this is, this is the hope. And this is what we can't let go of, is just to be able to stay committed, stay hopeful, even when we feel there is no hope, because ultimately brutality and cruelty, as they say, is an old story, but courage never is. And there's a lot of courage on this panel. And thank you, Mouaz, for the opportunity that you gave us years ago. I know my family wanted to do a personal intervention when I told them I was jumping out to Syria, but I have no regrets and will continue to work on behalf of the Syrian people.
Omar, you got born there.
You beautiful people, the regime has always tried to break us, not only physically, but mentally. Regime wanted us to be hopeless, to be ugly, to kill each other, to be afraid from sharing our stories. The regime wanted us to think about our stories as brutal stories that nobody's able to understand or to imagine. The only way to win against this regime is actually to tell them about the beauty we managed to create in this darkness. And this background behind me makes so perfect sense for telling this story. It's the regime want us to think that nobody would be able to understand or relate. And we only win if we can make people relate. We only win if we simplify the stories, if we tell about the small normal emotions that everybody feels, that everybody knows. That's the way to tell the story. That's the way to be hopeful, to break the regime, and to be mentally as strong as you could be after going through all this hell of torture, war, and atrocities in Syria.
Was last word.
So I'm still, every time I listen to Omar, and I talk to him all the time, not just when he's publicly speaking, just on a regular phone call or anything, he's inspirational. And the fact is that SETF couldn't have achieved the things that this organization has without amazing people like every single person on this panel that's like family. I mean, Deb, I don't know how many stories as a legendary journalist you've done and made sure to cover Syria even when the outlets didn't want to at times. I think Andrea, an amazing filmmaker who, like Deb, snuck into Syria with me multiple times, but even like faced up to people with an AK to make sure to cover a story of a hospital that's being put between a Christian and a Muslim village. in Idlib, Ambassador Rapp, what you've done with Caesar and the work that you've led on the legal work is, I think, helped revolutionize how people can pursue international justice when we don't have an international court. And Omar, you you represent the Syrian people that we're working on behalf, so it's an honor to always be with you. And Bhavna and the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation and Night and your whole team and family, having people that have your back at a time when sometimes things feel too tough is the most important thing for us to continue our work. So I just want to encourage everyone that's listening to us here today. We all learn about these horrific things, these literally called never again moments, although they happen all the time. We always look back as we study in high school or college, or from our grandfather or from whoever, our grandmother, like, teach us about these things that happened a long time ago, whether it's the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide, or the list goes on. And we think to ourselves that if we were there then, we would do something. Well, here is a chance for you to be involved. It can be writing a letter of hope. It can be supporting a school for orphans. It can be calling your representative. It could be supporting the Victims Fund. Go to the SyrianTaskForce.org, the Syrian Emergency Task Force's website, and learn about how you can be part of this family that you're seeing on screen and the others that are behind the scenes doing amazing work. But thank you for this opportunity, Spark Media. Thank you all for joining. And I really want to thank you, Deb, for leading us through this really, I think, powerful panel.
Thanks, Mouaz. And thanks, everybody, for coming. We'll do this again. Thank you.
Thank you.